Here is Vinta Ochre.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
As a brown, there is a bit of an orange lean, but it is an ochre, so it's fine here. I'll let it go because of the name we're going with. This has plenty of tone variation that changes slightly with each nib, and it shades. Now I have to say, for the tone variation that you get by nib, it is absolutely really appropriate in the amount of change that you get by nib. It shades very well and is pleasing to look at all the time. I actually like that this is also usable kind of as an orange or as a brown. It's a brown, but if you were to call it a dark burnt orange, people might not realize it, with ochre being kind of a range. I see a lot of personality really coming through with this ink, and I'm enjoying using it. It falls in that category of, man, am I glad that I'm trying this ink out, because I would probably be missing something if I didn't.
The pen for today is a Diplomat Arrow. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, you really do see that kind of orange lean that this ink can have. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. You see it does shade incredibly well. Better in some words, like you see it in have or pardon, and you do see the shading even very lightly in words like twice or my, where occasionally, such as the word now, there's very little shading. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. I say quite a bit as in it starts there, but the majority of the writing is just a bit darker that you would expect from a drier to a wetter pen. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade much better than it did with the soft fine nib, probably for this being a much wetter pen. I think the shading every single time comes through very well. It really does something to draw your attention into the writing, which is always good when the ink can help keep your attention on the writing itself. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little darker than we had with the soft fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade like a beast. It's a nice darker orange on the orange tones, definitely into a orange leaning brown. Beautiful in what's going on all the time. Look at Not Today, right on the second line. Absolutely, like as a what's written, my eyes go straight to that. It is nice. Looking at the broad nib, we get very much the same tones that we had with the medium. It does not feather, does not spread. Both of those would be a surprise on this paper. Does it shade? Yes, it does. Now, it's not shading as well as it did with the medium nib, but it is shading incredibly well. In fact, if I was not looking at these side by side, I might think of them as shading very much the same way. It is beautiful. Look at the word tomorrow, or directly underneath that, good, or the. 3 letters, 3 tones, beautiful. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily write back here.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is right about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, not spreading, it's not shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, though we are still getting shade. You see it in his first word, darker into lighter. Round starts darker, gets lighter, gets darker again. Now the darker tones that we're seeing here are just darker, not much darker, like we tend to have seen on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit darker. It's a little darker than what we saw on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading incredibly well on this paper, really showing the standout quality of the production of this paper. And we're going to be taking a look at a few different reporter notebooks over some time here, so I'm happy to be using this one. Looking at the medium nib, it is generally the same tone that we got with the wet fine, which is lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it is not feathering, not spreading, it is shading, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Better than it did, I want to say, on the soft fine with this paper, though not getting as dark as it did with the wet fine. It's shading very well. You see it in just about every single word. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we got with the medium. It does not feather, does not spread, it does shade just a tad bit less than we got with the medium here. It is still a bit lighter in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. I think every nib on this paper wound up looking very good and really usable, which I love not being restricted in what I use. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is very minimal. You can probably write back here without a problem. There was absolutely no bleed through that touched the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine, we get just a tad bit lighter tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, still a tad bit darker than it was on the Portage notebook. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading, not as frequently, but it is still shading kind of as well. You see it really in particular letters, like if you look at the word fight, the I and the T are much darker than the rest of the word, but a majority of this writing is very much one tone. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is not feathering and it is not spreading. It is shading some, though a majority of what we're getting is the darker tone. You do see some of those lighter tones show up, like in of, in queer, in hobbits on the fourth line. Fourth line, I'm really seeing it a whole lot more, but third line onto, I think it's shading very nicely. I really like the tone I'm getting. Looking at the medium nib, we get a little lighter tone than we had with the wet fine. Quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, to be honest. Again, I see them side by side. It does not feather, does not spread, and yes, it does shade incredibly well. Every single word really brings the shading for you to enjoy for those that like shading. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, if you don't like shading, you don't like this ink. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tiny bit darker than it was with the medium, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. I know people like to say these are the same paper. They're not the same paper, though the same manufacturer, as in both are owned by Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade incredibly well. And I think it's shading a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine, which it's doing it so well, it's almost a shame that what I'm using here in this case is a graph, because it can be distracting. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we had no bleeding, there was no ghosting, there's nothing. You can easily write back here, absolutely perfect.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, the most noticeable thing right away is how the color is changed from the paper underneath, and it really looks much more like a red than it does an orange or an ochre. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading very well, and that's one of the reasons that I do like this paper is I have seen it shade pretty decent with a bunch of different inks. So we're also going to be taking a look at some Steno books in the future at one point. So nice. Looking at the wet fine nib, really much darker than the soft fine, but really looks red. It just looks like a red ink. Now, as a red, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. There is some shading going on. You see it in Wednesday, and you see it in Yesterday, and you see it in Flustered. It's there, but it's red. It's not ochre or orange. Just not a great combination here. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than we had with the wet fine. It is quite a bit lighter than was on the Clairfontaine. As a tone, we're getting not really red, although when it shades, it's going to shade towards red. We're really seeing kind of a light red, orange leaning tone, a very confusing combination going on there. I think the color looks nice on this paper, but you're not getting the color that you would expect at all. It simply means that this ink is a little more translucent, and the tone of the paper is really affecting it. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone as the medium. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well as the medium did. Its color is not the same as on the Clairfontaine, not a shock anytime you change the color of the paper that you're writing on. But what is going on here, I think it is usable in what I'm seeing, that it is a kind of orange leaning red. Not my favorite of tones, but I don't think this is bad considering the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we have almost no ghosting. You could write back here without any kind of problems at all. There was no bleed through, nothing touched the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Light Aztec Gold. Here is Organic Studios Boron Brown. Here is Private Reserve Ebony Brown. Here is Sailor Kobe No. 16 Nada Brown. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, as a tone, it's a little more red leaning than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is shading better than this paper has done for me on some different inks, and some of those will be seen through time, some of them we have already seen. not a paper that's really known to bring out the shading. So when shading does show up on this paper, I always appreciate it that much more. Looking at the wet fine nib, we get very much the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. While it's very much the same tone, a little bit more muted, the kind of thing you'll hear for this paper. It is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is shading some, a little bit more than it did with the soft fine, not as much as it did on the Clairfontaine, not at all. More what I see is some tone variation depending on the word. No reason for me to really know why it's doing that. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than we had with the wet fine. It is much more of an orange here than an ochre brown. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading. I think the shading shows up better than it did with the wet fine. Nowhere near as good as it did on the Clairfontaine, but looks very nice on this paper. I think it's really holding its own without any kind of problems. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade less than it did with the medium, so it shows up at times, but intermittently, not in any kind of predictable way where you sort of expect it on the downstroke on the last letter of words. You would really expect to be able to see it. It's not always there, which, okay, considering the paper, I don't care for this tone on this paper like this, but I don't think what's happening is bad. Looking at the back of the page, ghosting is way under control, not a problem at all. There is no bleed through touching the page underneath, making this a winner.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Pilot Cosmosu or Cosmos. Here is a green ink by Blackstone Australian Bush. Here is an orange ink by Krishna Orange. Here is a blue-black ink by Noodler's 54th Massachusetts. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is quite a bit darker. A few steps darker. It's darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. More absorbent paper, so shouldn't be a surprise when you write on a sponge. It does feather a little bit, and I mention it because it's a little bit, and we definitely see it anytime it gets darker, so spoiler, there are some moments of shading that'll happen. There is a little bit of spread that will happen, and none of that is any kind of surprise for this. Looking at the wet fine nib, we do get feathering, tiny all over it. I think it's manageable, just like the soft fine was very manageable. There is some spread. It takes it to just a little beyond a medium, I think. There is some shading, but with the shading comes more feathering. So it's not something that I would go for a wet fine with this paper, but currently it looks like a dry soft fine works without a problem. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than we had with the wet fine. It is quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It is very much an orange on the page that does feather very manageably, does spread, but does not spread as much as the wet fine did. It does not offer any kind of shading, which my experience with copy paper is if it doesn't shade, that's usually a good thing for controlling any kind of bleeding. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the medium, still quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, rather consistent, tiny feathers that I don't see as really a problem. I say they are consistent because you're not surprised to see them, but they're certainly not on every letter or every word. There is some spread, just a little bit of it. I think it's manageable in what's happening. There is no shading, which I'm going to call as a good sign when it comes to bleeding. Looking at the back of the page, we see there was quite a bit that came pretty deep into the paper, but none of this touched the page underneath, so there was no corrupting the next page. Anytime I deal with copy paper and it does not touch the page underneath, that is a huge win to me.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Now, for cheaper paper, I would really say that your much drier pens are without a doubt a way to go because the performance is then usable. Any other paper, wetter pens really darken it up and bring out even more shading. On all nib sizes, I think this needs a wet pen of any nib size. And it's beautiful, really attention grabbing. That's what I want in my writing, is for people to pay attention to what I write. This ink, as long as the pen is wet, will do it.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.